Lights.
Hmm.
So, yeah, hello everyone. Welcome to our reproducibility tea talks. This is the first one in this academic year, and I'm very happy to renew this practice. So, I've been in touch with Vivek in February, and I've managed to invite him over to come and join us in October. So, because I've come across the title of his talk on incentivizing good research practices at Newcastle University. So, we often discuss this topic in the Q&A section of our talks, but I thought it would be a great opportunity to have a dedicated talk on this important topic. So, basically, what is Vivek going to present today is the ideas for individuals, but also institutions and funders, and actually have an open discussion about how we can encourage more open and obviously rigorous research. So, Vivek, I think, yeah, without much ado, we could move to your talk.
Uh, sure, yeah. Thanks a lot for the invitation. And it was just having, I guess this is where it's nice to make these connections across different people who are work different universities or organizations that are interested in this. And so I think I really appreciate the opportunity to talk. I'm going to share my slides now. And yeah, so I guess two things. One is I think most of the talk is just my thoughts, which I've put together. So, I think of the talk as being a start of a discussion point. So it's not that I've done a period of research and what helps and what doesn't help. And I'm presenting the results of that research to you. It's more that these are ways in which I can conceive that we can do better. And I'm open to suggestions or critiques as well. I titled the talk Incentivizing Good Research rather than necessarily titling it something focused more on reproducibility or open research, because I think all of that is captured by this idea of good, because I believe that those are what leads to good research. And some of it is also the idea is I guess I keep trying to remind ourselves or myself and stuff that what we want is to find out the truth about something. And we have to find ways of getting better at doing that. So uh, I'm going to start by talking about the costs of research and the problem that I see with doing or implementing open science practices. Or I'm just using that as a blanket term: reproducibility, open science practices, any of these. I think all of these do take time. So if you want to do things correctly, you need to have pilot experiments, which give you some sense of the effect size, and then plan based on that, the sample size you will need in the actual experiment, maybe the kind of analysis you need, maybe the kind of approaches you need. So you need all of that preparation time. And then something that I've been doing for my work recently, which is again a big recommended practice, is pre-registering your hypothesis, pre-registering the sample size, pre-registering the analyses, so that then you can show full transparency of how you've approached it and restrict your degrees of freedom to do things like having a hypothesis after your results are known, or making a decision on this. If some of you have read this paper on the garden of forking paths, so making these multiple decisions after your data is there. So that's what pre-registration helps with. Afterwards, once you've got your results, you've got everything done. To be able to submit your data and your code, you need to prepare them, write them, annotate them, present them in a way that's understandable, accessible, freely available. All of this takes time. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes sometimes, especially with code, for example, I do code, I do analyze my data with statistical code, but I'm not the best coder. So I don't have good practice in code necessarily. My comments might not be as much as I could be, for example, things. So you need to get better at those skills as well. The other big issues, of course, that we all end up sometimes with null results, and we all have to decide what to do with null results. And these are results that don't fit the hypothesis that you might have wanted, which perhaps makes it harder to publish. And even if you spend the time and effort, which I do try to ensure that we do in the lab, to publish those results, they're not going to be cited as much. They're not going to, win you as much kudos, and you've spent all that effort for something like that. Now, my worries about the costs of doing good research is what the effects of this will be. So if you have scientists, imagine a scientist who's spending all the time to do all of this correctly and, really finding things which are reliable. But then the selection environment we live in, and I'm using this term because I come from a kind of an evolutionary biology background. So there's this idea that there are pressures, and who survives the pressure is what you see in the population remaining. And so you have a bunch of scientists, and you have some of them who are putting all this effort, and then you have some who don't. But given that you might then have this selection environment where you have very limited number of jobs and a certain type of people perhaps who sit on panels or have expectations, also limited time on these panels for evaluating CVs. So very often the proxy is just how many publications does someone have? Where are these publications? What is the impact factor? And this is the environment which we live in. And my fear is because this is the environment we live in, the people who do spend the time to doing good research have fewer publications because each publication takes more time. They perhaps have more publications which aren't as high profile because they do publish their null results as well. And so those are precisely the people who will not get the jobs, who will not get the promotions because they are outcompeted by people who perhaps aren't investing so much in these efforts. And I think that's a real problem because then, despite all the efforts we put in to get things better, what you might end up having is the only people who do survive in the system are people who, do what the system demands and don't try to rethink our practices. I think that's something we really need to grapple with, and what my inspiration for the talk was precisely on how do we start making this better. And there are different levels at which we can start making this better. So it depends on who you are. Some of this is kind of addressed or comes into play with the UK Reproducibility Network's reward and recognition program. And for those of you who might not know this, it's, of course, this kind of pyramid idea where you first have to make it possible to provide the infrastructure to do the research the way we think is good, then make it easier, then make it normative, so this is what we expect, and then reward it so that you actually are recognized for what you're doing, and then finally to make it required, so we really have to. So people are thinking along the lines which I'm going to outline a bit, but I guess, yeah, if you make it required, then obviously everyone's going to do it, or at least, and then if you make it rewarded as well, there's an incentive to do it, and that's kind of the level at which I'm going to be focusing on. And as they say in this policy document or the procedures, it's whether it's for recruitment or promotion, also things like probation and annual performance, all will need to fit into this format. So one idea I had is perhaps I wonder if you could use this scale to kind of move towards something like an Athena Swan recognition for a university. And that might be one way in which we can bring all of this to bear. So, at least how it used to be, I don't know if it's changed now, is that Athena Swan was sometimes, and again, for those who don't know, Athena Swan was this effort to promote, I guess it was projected at least as primarily to increase the participation of women researchers and support women researchers in science. But the way I look at it is it increased the kind of the support level we give to researchers in general. And I think everybody benefited from that approach, but it was often tied to funding. So you could only get funding if you had a certain award level of Athena Swan to show that you were supporting researchers. So I was just wondering if we had that kind of approach where we say there's a certain level of support for open research or reproducibility research, then the universities could apply for funding. What I do in the rest of the talk is I'm going to try and think through at different levels and different, I guess, bodies that are involved in science, how they could try to encourage this practice. And so I don't know exactly who's going to be listening to this talk, but hopefully I will be able to cover most of the people who are listening to the talk. And I've tried to include people from junior group members, so perhaps who don't lead the group, but are members of a lab, group leaders who are the PIs of a lab, and then departments and universities, and then people involved in the publication process, whether it's publishers, editors, and peer reviewers, and finally the funders, because I think all of these groups can actually try to change something. I'll go through each one in turn. So the first one is the junior group researchers. And I think in some ways, these people are, well, they have the least power to change things in some ways, but they've also, I think, been some of the most strong and vocal about the need for change. And despite not having power, have really been pushing for this change, which is, immensely appreciable. And in some ways, that's my main cause of concern, that if these are the people who want to change how things are, and the people fighting for that are not going to go on to get jobs, then that's a huge problem, because we won't be getting their expertise in this. Some suggestions I had is people who are in this position could flag up resources for the lab if they're interested, to show how we can do things better. Teach the PI, so talk to your head of lab and tell them, this is how we can do things better. I want to do things better. Look, our lab is not currently doing certain kinds of practices. Maybe we should improve. And certainly, like, even I am now a PI, and I think I've definitely benefited from people in my lab pointing out how we could do things better. And sometimes, you just have this area which you haven't thought about, or you're not focusing on, and so it's obvious when it's pointed out to you, but you haven't got there necessarily. And so it's very good to have someone pointing out. And I guess for that, you need to have that atmosphere to be able to do that. The other thing we could do, and I think science in general does this, and perhaps we sometimes underappreciate this, is that replications are very often built into the projects themselves. So when we think of replications, and obviously this is a big issue, certainly starting from psychology, but spreading further, of the reproducibility crisis, that we don't know which results will hold up or be robust enough when you repeat them. And I think a lot of research where the results are really groundbreaking or super important do get repeated, because people want to build on those results and test them and have ideas for them. And that's great. I think that's the normal process of science. But there are many results perhaps that don't, or partly because maybe people aren't following up on work and just accept something as given, and there's no kudos in purely repeating what someone else has done, because you can, and then you can publish it. But again, why are you doing this would be a question. Like, you're not doing something innovative or novel. But one way of addressing that is to build on it, build that into your work, and then take it forward. So that's something, I think we can all try to do, whether, well, at any stage, but I think there's something the junior members can kind of push forward for. And in some ways, it's also good for them to, engage with the past literature as well. As group leaders, so this is kind of currently the position I'm in, so I've thought a bit about this. And I do assure basically all my lab members that we will publish null results. So, not to, obviously it's sometimes disappointing when you had a picture of where you would get to with your work, but your hypothesis isn't held up by the data. It's a really useful contribution. I'm not down on that at all, but it needs to be published. And again, that's sometimes the struggle. There are different ways of doing this. One argument is just perhaps to save time to leave it as the preprint, so it's out there and you're not pushing for it. It depends on how preprints are perceived. So I do try, in our lab, we have successfully managed to publish things even outside of preprints, and find the right journal which would be willing to publish this. What I've been finding, first, I think people are harsher with null results. And because what I found often is that you set up a hypothesis and you say, this is what we meant to test, and then you don't find it. People often question, which is odd, but they would question, why have you written it up with that hypothesis? You don't find it. It's almost like they don't want the story. Like we fooled them into believing this is what we're finding in the paper, but we didn't find it. Whereas for me, what I'm trying to do is often trying to be as honest as possible, that this is what we said we would look for, but we didn't find it. And so I think there are problems with how the reviewers often address these null results, but I think it's handleable, and we have managed to do that. You can also combine null results again with something that's positive, and that whole package deal is easier to publish than just the null results. So that's one way of going about it. And again, I'm kind of skipping over the fact of why we need to publish null results and many of the reasons why I think these are good policies. But hopefully, with all your past talks and your, I guess, the shared environment you're in, you do understand just really quickly that I feel, for me, the importance of publishing null results is that people aren't repeating the same things again and again. So there's this whole thing of the file drawer problem where people have, done work which has shown something but doesn't work and then not published it, which means every other group might do the same thing. And so it's important for you to put that out there. And I think of course, there are issues with null results in the sense that you don't know if you've really disproved something. It's easier to really prove something. But I guess it adds to data. It adds to, as more and more people publish null results on the same phenomenon, I think it adds weight to the fact that maybe that's not really happening. But you need to get that result out there, or at least it tests the robustness of something, right? So if you have a hypothesis that something should work out, or it has been published and it has worked out, showing it doesn't in other circumstances is a super important contribution. I think as group leaders, it's also really important that we can create this environment that is accepting of errors. So if people make mistakes, if they screw up in any way, you have to allow them to come up and tell you and make, and not be penalized or attacked. Or, especially also if the hypothesis isn't being proven, I say from the beginning, that's totally great. Like, you have to tell me. And I think often, especially very junior researchers, I sometimes have found, I don't know, undergraduates or someone who actually might come up to you and say, oh, I didn't include that data because it wasn't fitting our hypothesis. And as if, without thinking twice about it, as if that's the really normal thing. And so, just a second. Yeah. So, yeah, I think to make that clear from the very beginning that no, we're not looking to prove the hypothesis. We're looking to test the hypothesis, and anything that, even mistakes that are there, please come and tell me. And I think in the past, I've also had this where I was looking back on records myself as a postdoc and found one entry was, flipped from another entry. So the entries were flipped for two different subjects, and that made a huge difference to the results. It made it, from significant, not significant. But there can be this temptation to just shut up about it and publish the paper. But I think as a PI, you need to make sure that people come and tell you that that's okay, and and it's fine. I think it's useful. This might maybe my own bias, that it's useful to emphasize collaboration over competition, again, so that you're not forcing this idea that we have to get the best results before anyone else does, and try to do that. We could also think about recruitment, and when we're recruiting, to think about people who understand open research, who have done good practice before, to do that. And like I said, just for the junior researchers, we can also build in replications for projects. So this is my broad idea, the kind of ethos that I try to do in the lab. We discuss open research in lab meetings as well, and try to have a pipeline of how the practice works, whether it's pre-registration, open data, open code, all of these. And I talk about that, and we try to implement that culture in the lab. So I guess group leaders in general can set that culture, which is, I guess, really great for me. I think so, at least. Okay. I think for departments and universities, there are a different set of things that could be done. Again, some with some overlap on what I talked about before. One of the things I've been wondering about is whether again, mostly during the recruitment process or the promotions or assessment process, perhaps we could have CVs without journal names, with just the DOI. And many universities are signed on to DORA now, which basically kind of, you argue that you're not looking at metrics like impact factor and things like that. In which case, I don't see the point of a journal name apart from kind of, impressing you with a preformed notion of what the paper should be like. I've heard some arguments against this, and I'm very happy to do that, to talk about more in the discussion. But I think, if you have the title, maybe you could have short summaries, or sometimes now applications ask you to give a count of your top 5 publications, summarize what they did and what was important about them. I think something like that might be useful, maybe the abstract of the paper. And that might be a good way of judging contributions to the public record. Again, narrative CVs are increasingly with UKRI now common, where you don't even put in the journal names, you just have your achievements and what your scientific achievements are. That's another way of avoiding this. Like I said, with the group leaders you could hire with open research as a criterion, as an essential or desired criterion. Perhaps you could even add more weight. Some of my worries are, again, like if you had someone who had 3 null results published in journals that aren't as high impact, so to speak, versus a candidate who had 1 or even 3 Nature papers, who are you going to hire? For most people, I'm not sure I wouldn't say or be impressed myself that you would immediately say, oh, the Nature papers, that's shiny, but then you're creating exactly the kind of atmosphere which will prevent null results from being published. And um, there needs to be a way to combat that. Include good research practices such as this, or at least, ask for people to make statements about that in your promotion criteria. And I think, again, things like advocacy for open research work, or helping others to do that, that should be part of our, could be acknowledged if you're doing it as part of your job. So to have roles where this is important, this is part of what you're doing. And so I was thinking maybe that could be built in to your workload model. And departments and universities could have that as a criteria. I think a lot of departments and universities nowadays are talking about research culture and related activities. And I mean, that's a really broad idea. It perhaps includes things like EDI, it perhaps includes things like infrastructure and how things work. But I think one of the things it could include is things like open research and trying to get it, create an atmosphere where you do better. Okay, I think we have 2 more. So with publishers, editors, peer reviewers, again, we're seeing a lot of this change already happening, which is great. To have open data and code be compulsory. I think sometimes there are kind of slip-ups in this where I guess this is more perhaps a reviewer or editor's problem, where all it requires is the author to say, we have made the data available, and nobody checks up. And I think more often than not, I've had papers where I wanted to follow up on the data and clicked on the link that's provided, but it's not available, which means the peer reviewer hasn't even done the basic thing of clicking on a link and checking if it has what it should have. And I think that should be part of the peer review process. It should be part of the editorial process. The editor, I think, should kind of do this and make sure everything's in place even before sending it out to peer review. And I think that should be done before peer review, because the peer review process should look at the data and the code as part of the peer review. I certainly do. Obviously, we're not going to run. What I try to do is to run an analysis code with the data set to make sure first that that whole line is there. And then at least some of the key results, the numbers match up with what's reported in the paper. I do this when I'm publishing a paper myself to make sure that my code is giving me the results that I quote. But also it would be great if other people peer reviewed my research or anyone's research to make sure that's there. And it's kind of a quality control, if nothing else. That's one way of thinking of it, that any product that you put out in the world, in industry, you would check for that quality before putting it out, an independent assessment, and it's a very similar process. It would be great if journals were more willing to publish null results. Especially, I find often journals that universities do have these big agreements with for funding, where it is now increasingly free for people at universities to publish research, like you don't have to pay to publish the research. Those journals are almost precisely the ones that don't publish null results, or often are unwilling. And that puts you in a bind, because again, that's, I think, part of a problem where, okay, I do want to publish this, but I don't know where to publish it. And if I do want to publish it, I need to pay, I don't know, £6,000 or whatever. I mean, maybe £1,500. Registered reports is, again, something more journals could offer. There are some, and there are a good number, some of good quality. This is, again, for those who might not know, these are, this is an approach where a journal, what you submit to the journal is the kind of the introduction and the methods, your plan, which is then peer reviewed. And and if accepted, the journal undertakes to publish that paper regardless of the results. So you do all of this before running the experiment. And then you run the experiment, you get your results, and the paper the journal is going to publish. So the idea is that the journal is interested in the question, made sure your approach is correct, and then would publish it. Again, this is one way null results get published. It's a way that people can ask good questions without having that on their head. I've thought a bit about this idea of perhaps you could have rating system for reproduced research. So just how robust is the result, how often you are expected to replicate. And it would be good to see this across different labs or if it's been done multiple times. Yeah, so that's something, but I'm not completely sure, but it is something I wanted to throw out there. The other thing I was thinking of is to ensure that, like I was talking about initially, that the data and the code and everything are really shared. And perhaps we shouldn't peer review without shared code and data, because again, that's one way of assuring that the quality is what you expect it to be. I haven't included over here open access, because I think increasingly that has become the norm. There are questions about the costs of open access, and this is especially true, I think, for developing countries. Again, hopefully there are enough exceptions so people in developing countries who can't afford the costs still can publish without paying those costs, publish open access. The way at least I'm encountering the system nowadays is a lot of the journals have agreements with my university, which allow me to publish open access without it coming even from my grant or from, of course, my personal money or from the university's money. So it's a good step, but sometimes the costs can be exorbitant, and I think that is an issue in itself for various reasons. Yeah. Finally, for funders, I think funders, it would be great if they funded, replication efforts to make sure perhaps really important results. I don't know if we can think of some things that deserve that attention to make sure that they are really true. Of course, we have already plans that require open data and open access when you are funded by a certain funder, and that's great to see. It'd be great to see it widespread. It might one interesting idea is perhaps every project would be expected to include a replication or to show that you're building on results and therefore you would automatically replicate something like that might be interesting. It would be great if funders could also allow for slow science. So again, in terms of how a person's track record is assessed or how the project might play out, to allow for this kind of ability to build on results and explore them rather than finding the shiniest thing and publish it immediately. So these are some ideas I had about how funders could contribute it. I've ended, the last slide I have is kind of going in a different direction. So I'll bring it up in a minute, but for now, the ideas, these were the kind of suggestions I could come up with. Obviously, we can discuss if they even seem effective or not to different people. Also, people have different ideas. I think we should keep that conversation going. But to shift tracks now, one of the things which I've more recently been thinking about is especially this idea, which I don't know if all of you have followed this up, is when in the US government came up with this idea of restoring gold standard science. And a lot of the language they use is about how we might talk about open access research and related topics, but it's used to imply that a lot of science that has happened already is completely wrong, and therefore nothing that has been done should be trusted. And I think what we really need to think about is how do we work in this environment, and how do we resist, or not resist necessarily, but respond to this co-option of that language? What are our goals and how are they different from the goals of perhaps the Trump administration, and make that clear. There's been a divide. I can already see this, and some of the big open science advocates have almost been fairly positive while still distinguishing themselves from this statement, whereas others have said the language used by open science has itself been too critical while ignoring key facts about how science operates itself in terms of self-corrections and replications. And so I think we should think about these things, and based on that, our incentives should also be modified based on that. So yeah, I'm going to stop there and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's fascinating, Vivek, very interesting and so systematic. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions before I go ahead with mine? Right.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Yeah. Thank you. That was really interesting to hear. And I think it was really insightful to see kind of the ways you were reflecting on it. From my background, I kind of thought you were going to look a lot more about like the kind of data sort of management side, so managing the data and capturing it. But it's really interesting to see how you've embedded this, not just from that, but also into the kind of the whole research process. You seem to be reflecting on it right through the publication. And so I guess my question to you is like, if I was a new researcher looking at this, what would be your kind of top key takeaway that I should have for how to do this effectively to ensure I get good research through my research project?
Again, it would depend on the level, but assuming you're a researcher starting out, so say a PhD student or a postdoc, I think you could just build in practices that people have already talked about, whether it's pre-registration protocols, power analysis before, pilot experiments, and what are the various other things like being blind to your data when you're coding it or analyzing it, different conditions, all these, almost you could say classic things, which we all know leads to good research or is good scientific practice leading. But the only thing I would say is I can completely understand at that level to be concerned about time and your need to demonstrate productivity. So as much as I might give this advice, I feel it's a bit unfair to almost mandate it without changing what that leads to or what that gets you to. So I think a lot of the onus for me does start with the funders, the institutions, and panels and job recruitment panels, and we should initiate really focus at my own feeling our efforts into changing those systems and those approaches before we make any demands of junior researchers.
So that's really interesting because I think you made that kind of comment of what we know will lead to good research, and I think you're absolutely right. So from my background at the archive, I understand what those things would be, and I'm sure others who have more experience would. I wonder whether does that kind of lead us down to kind of like a training program to support early career researchers, which highlights all those brilliant things you've just talked about, but should be perhaps embedded within part of the funder requirements. Maybe they have to undertake certain training, or that an institute builds a program specifically to cover the kind of things you've talked about to ensure that the students have that support. So I wonder whether there's like some changes we could make institutionally or across the sector to help support early career researchers with the specific things you've just rightly identified there.
I think that's a great idea. I think that's really great, which everyone, because there's so many mandatory courses that junior researchers have to go through anyway. I mean, I know they probably hate another one to be added to the list, but I think it is a great idea. I guess the only thing I would slightly add to that, I was kind of self-reflecting as I was saying that phrase is, I think we need to be careful. Just give me a second. I'm going to put on my headphones. I think we need to be careful about making sure that whatever policy we're recommending in the training courses, for example, does lead to good research. And there's been some criticism recently. I need to read up more on this, for example, about pre-registration and whether that actually does have the effect we think it does. So I'd like us to be led by that kind of empirical approach to research. Not to say there's been like a lot of research that has shown that it works, but we need to understand how and why it works as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. That was really informative. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Great idea, though. I should build it in.
Yeah, I've also been thinking about, finding this balance, and this is not really a question, perhaps me thinking aloud, finding this balance between making this a criterion and almost a requirement, and also making sure that we human beings we tend to find shortcuts.
Yeah.
Cheat the system.
Well, there's that. I think it has a name. There's this kind of principle where the minute you have any kind of metric, everyone tries to maximize that metric rather than doing what the metric is supposed to help you achieve. we're all because we're all human beings. It's partly like if we had the luxury and there weren't as many pressures, maybe we wouldn't game the system. But gaming the system not only gets you to better places, but it also sometimes is essential for getting a job or having a livelihood in the field. Then if you have pressures like that, then it's almost impossible to stick to your guns. Not impossible. Many people do, but still it's hard.
I was also thinking that at the individual level, there may be, as you said, there may be arguments both for and against, and sometimes even individuals may not want to hide the journal names because they must have worked so hard to get published in those journals. So yes. Figuring out how to frame. I guess lots of this is also related to framing and presenting and looking at different sides.
Yeah. I mean, maybe these kind of summaries of your achievements that could help. Like you can convey why that paper is important rather than relying on the title as a proxy, the journal name as a proxy. I don't know. I mean, I can see a counter argument that because it's so hard to get into these papers, journals, it is valid to use them. It's just that I guess I've encountered enough bad papers in these journals that I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
So it's dangerous. Yeah.
Yes, true. And I really this idea of a narrative summary of your achievements in terms of what you actually did in a particular paper or in a particular study, what was the importance of it? Yeah, articulating it. I think, and this is actually most of the times it's missing in CVs. Yeah, and
although I have to say the new UKRI CVs, they call these R4RI. I don't know if anyone's been, but which is basically a narrative CV with 4 different sections. They totally, they don't have that problem. You don't mention the journal. People try, but that's not how you're meant to do it. It's more about the achievements rather than the journals, and so that's already changed. It's completely the same now. Some misgivings I have on that is it might privilege people who are better at English, for example, who can write better, and English as a first language. Maybe that's a huge thing as well. So, but it does definitely solve this problem of purely using names and impact factor as metrics.
Yeah. I can also see how things can be managed at the level of peer reviewers. So training peer reviewers, for example, in the sense in the context of null results, that it really it's very important to interpret them and present the interpretation in a way to explain why it's important not to hide this null results.
I mean, that's why I think maybe a training course like Scott's could really help making sure of that.
But then I started thinking, but why? What maybe they're for editors? So is there any pressure on editors that they must, they must avoid null result publications?
Yeah, I mean, there are clear guidelines. I guess it's a journal policy rather than an editor policy. There are clear guidelines of which papers to accept and of whether how impactful a paper will be. Maybe there's some room for interpretation because a null result potentially can have impact, and in those cases, you should consider them. But maybe it's an easier rule of thumb is if you haven't shown it, it's easier to reject it. People might not even be submitting it. I think that's another issue, that people might not even submit null results to a journal, which is
quite often. Oh, yeah, interesting. So lots of food for thought. I still keep thinking about some other stuff as well. I was also thinking. So the sort at the level of this type of conversations we have, but also at the level of training, but also the importance of having a context-sensitive approach to this, because some of this may not be applicable to, let's say, qualitative data and social sciences. Yeah, so we still struggle. With sharing whole data because
And if you go to the humanities, for example, I don't know what the concept of reproducibility means there, because every analysis is unique or comes from a certain unique context. So maybe you wouldn't want it to be reproducible in the same way.
Yeah, and we're increasingly shifting the conversation towards open and transparent research rather than necessarily reproducible, because it's not always. Right. Okay. Well, thanks very much, Vivek.
Well,
that
thanks
was
a lot
so
for the
insightful.
invitation, Shafak.
I'm really glad we had this conversation. I'm so looking forward to sharing this with others.
Please, and let me know if anyone has comments or questions. You have my email ID.
I will. Thank you very much.
Okay,
I'm
thank you.
going to stop. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Please, thank you. Bye.